Two and a Half Admins, episode 246. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary article plug, Alan, is Owning the Stack, Infrastructure Independence with FreeBSD and ZFS.
Yeah, if you don't want your infrastructure beholden to some corporation, you might want to look at using FreeBSD and ZFS and being able to have all the freedom of a good open source license and the ability to modify and control everything about your operating system and file system without having to buy different licenses.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. Windows RDP lets you log in using revoked passwords. Microsoft is okay with that.
So the issue here is that the remote desktop protocol will cache validated logins. So it caches a token. This is much like the way it works when you log into Active Directory on a laptop that you might take home, and you can still log into your Active Directory account on the laptop at home even without a VPN connected because it's cached the valid authentication token that you got from the domain controller the last time, can see that your password that you entered in this time will still match that, and therefore it lets you in. Basically, remote desktop has a similar mechanism going, and the unfortunate thing is that this means that you might discover that your password got leaked in a some site breach, and that became part of a massive public data dump. And now you have RDP credentials that unknown numbers of ne'er-do-wells may be aware of. So you want to revoke that password and change it. Unfortunately, despite the fact that you did so, the devices that you RDP into will still remember the hashes for those old invalidated passwords and will let the attackers right on in should they be using that password that you changed. Now, this is already kind of a jaw dropper, in my opinion, as an InfoSec bug. But what really turns it into a head scratcher is when this issue was raised with Microsoft, Microsoft's answer was, yeah, we designed it that way. We like that. We think that's cool. That way you can always get in. What they don't seem to have considered is it means that way anybody who has access to any of your passwords can always get in.
What's worse is Windows Defender, Entra ID, and Azure don't raise any flags about this. It doesn't apparently go in the audit logs the same way as you would expect. There's no way for users to detect this and clear the old values or fix the issue. So in the Ars article, it says that even after you've changed your password, because it's cached the old one, it'll accept that. And if it can't reach the server to check a new one, it will not take the new password because it's not in the cache, whereas the old one is. So it's basically more likely that your new password won't work than your old password, which shouldn't work anymore, will work. And it seems very the opposite of what anybody would expect, right? If I go and change my password to make sure nobody can get in, and people can get in with the old password but can't get in with the new password, you're more likely to lock yourself out than to lock the bad guys out, and it makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, this is against the fundamental principles of InfoSec.
It really is. To be fair, I've been arguing for a very long time, frequently to people who aren't happy to hear it, that exposing RDP directly to the public internet is also a fundamental violation of InfoSec principles, because it wasn't designed for that. It's way overly complex for that. It's not a target you should be handing just anybody who can find an IP address. RDP is a great tool, but the way that it's been designed, I would never trust it beyond, a local network setting. You expose it to what subnets you absolutely need to. You control access to those subnets, and then you've got your password on top of all that stuff. But just expose it to the internet and anybody who can type in a password can get in, even without this particular bug. Nope, don't like it.
Yeah, you're saying keep it on the LAN on specific subnets as well as VPNs, presumably.
Yeah, exactly. In most environments, just not exposing it to the internet is enough. You say, okay, anybody who can get on my LAN, that is a sufficient indication of trust that I'm willing to allow them to touch the interface where you enter credentials to potentially be allowed in for remote desktop. That makes sense. In larger environments where you have more humans and, therefore you've got more chaos going on, you may not want to expose, for example, the RDP for all of your servers to the 10,000 users who are on the campus somewhere who could otherwise touch the IP address of that server. You don't want to let just anybody get at that because, again, there are always issues with privilege escalation, you name it. It's not a good idea exposure-wise. So in a larger environment, you have your servers on a protected subnet where you've got a firewall in place that only allows the ports that are running services that you want to expose to your local area network. And you'll have policies about what is or is not accessible from, VPN segments. And in a large enough environment, you may have multiple VPN segments as well, where you've got a lot of IP-based filtering that controls what you're even allowed to try to log into. Because the bad thing about filtering something based on what network segment, that's coming in from is that's very crude. There's not much you can do with it. The excellent thing about it is it's very crude, which means it can be implemented very simply without leaving a whole lot of attack surface exposed. The credential harvesting necessary to process whether or not a particular user is authorized to access a particular machine with RDP, there's a lot of complexity going on there. And there's even more when you just kind of look at the long history of remote desktop and the particular goals of Microsoft and the use cases they envisioned it for. It's just not as hard baked as something like SSH. And SSH has had its own share of security issues over the years, but a whole lot less than remote desktop. And a lot of that reason is because it was designed to be a much simpler and more robust, more difficult to attack initial interface.
And kind of the worst part of this is the only thing Microsoft is willing to do about this so far is adding a small red admonition box to their documentation that says, when a user performs a local login, their credentials are verified locally against a cached copy before being authenticated with an identity provider over the network. If the cache verification is successful, the user gains access to the desktop even if the device is offline. However, if the user changes their password in the cloud, the cached verifier is not updated, which means they can still access their local machine using their old password. They don't seem to point out how that maybe means a lot more than you think it means. Like, you change your password and it doesn't matter. And in addition to not having any cache invalidation, it doesn't seem like the Windows caching thing here ever checks to see if the password is newer in the cloud. Like, is there a reason not to limit the length that we'll do in the cache or only fall back to the cache when we can't verify online? Even if they only verified when you're not online, that would still be a security hole in that I could purposely unplug this computer from the internet and then log into it or DDoS it such that it couldn't reach Microsoft and then be able to log in with a cache credential. But that would at least be slightly better than just, no, we always cache it and ignore a more valid copy.
They seem so strangely stubborned up on this one that it's hard not to suspect that some manager involved with the project once screwed up in some way that locked himself out of his own machine and not having a cache invalidated was the only way he got back in. He was like, well, I'm never changing that behavior.
That or the scaling for the Azure identity stuff just couldn't handle every Windows machine checking the login password every time somebody logged in.
That is also an excellent point. Too expensive won't fix.
Broadcom sends cease and desist letters to subscriptionless VMware users.
Yeah, so these are people that in the past bought a VMware Perpetual license, meaning they paid once to be able to use it forever. And Broadcom saying, well, we changed the meaning of forever, or perpetual in this case. And so you have to stop using that old license you bought and pay us for a new one.
That's not quite correct as far as using the software itself. The issue is a little weirder than that. It's about support and updates. So what they're arguing here is that your old perpetual license allows you to continue using the software in the condition it was already in, but if you manage to apply any updates or patches to that software since when Broadcom bought VMware, you will no longer be in compliance with the terms of your license, and that's what they're sending the letters about. It already doesn't leave a great taste in anybody's mouth, but what makes it considerably worse is they're not just sending these letters out to people who they have some record of having downloaded updates recently despite having a perpetual license with, no rider for a new support agreement, with Broadcom. That would already be a little icky, but no, they appear to just be sending these letters to essentially a random subset of customers who have these perpetual licenses who I guess they think would benefit from a little ominous breathing down their necks. I don't know.
They seem to provide the updates so you can download them, then say, oh, you downloaded, therefore you've accepted the new agreement and you have to start paying us again.
At the risk of getting too spicy, do you remember when a lawyer figured out that he could just upload porn that he created himself to BitTorrent and then sue people for downloading it? So he was literally running a porn creation studio not to sell the porn, but to sue people who torrented it. So essentially what this all really boils down to is, if you are a current VMware user, you either need to make your peace with however much money Broadcom wants you to pay, or you need to get away. And you should probably be considering whether you really want to have an ongoing long-term mission-critical relationship with a company that, I don't want to use the word extorts, but let's just say exerts a lot of leverage over its customers in this particular way. Another thing that I think that's probably worth pointing out here is that the idea that you bought a perpetual license to something that normally requires a monthly license, it's almost never going to hold out. Like, nothing is actually forever. We all know that in, the most basic sense. The Earth won't be around forever, neither will the sun. The universe will eventually suffer a heat death. So obviously perpetual licenses have some limit on them, but the real answer is they have a much shorter limit on it than that, because there's going to be a change in management or a change in management policy. And whoever initially said, hey, everybody, we're selling perpetual licenses, so that I can get a bigger bonus because look at all the extra revenue I got this quarter, is going to get replaced by somebody going, damn it, we have all these people not paying us per month, so I can't raise the rates on them. In addition to the fact that I'm not getting recurring monthly revenue from these people, I can't get additional recurring revenue because I can't change the price because they already paid it. So they're going to start looking for a way to invalidate that. Now, if software was a static thing that didn't ever need changes, then you could buy it and keep using it. And there's not much that anybody could do about that. But unfortunately, that's not how software works. I could sit here and try to blow your skirt up and say that, well, the only real solution here is open source because you've been given a perpetual license and that perpetual license cannot be taken away. But there are still some potential loopholes there, particularly if you're not going GPL. If you're looking at a more permissive license like FreeBSD's license, then there's not really anything to say that that company, again, won't change hands and won't change its policy on the new software that it's writing as updates and patches to close holes and to bring that software in line with the rest of the software ecosystem, which, again, is why software is never done. Even if your program is relatively simple, even if the job your program does won't change over the course of the next century, you're not done writing it for the next century because everything else in the software ecosystem that your application has to live in and coexist with is changing. And some of those changes are going to break your stuff and you've got to keep up with them. So ultimately, you're always renting software and you kind of have to be careful about who you rent it from.
I was going to say there is some creative software that does its job, like some of the music software that I've got, for example. I've got perpetual licenses for that and just run it on an offline system. And it works perfectly well for now. But I suppose eventually I'll have to update the operating system and then it won't work. So on a long enough timeline, you're right.
Yeah. How many CPM programs are you running these days?
Well, indeed.
And that's the thing. There actually are a lot of truly ancient software packages that people are going to great lengths to keep running in their initial environment, sandboxed off from the rest of the world. You see that in a lot of, financial situations where they have this, truly ancient COBOL framework that works really well. And so they run it very isolated on legacy hardware and or hardware configured to provide an emulated environment, just like the one that software was designed to run in. But now you're committed to providing this weird environment. You can't just go down to Best Buy and grab whatever laptop off the shelf and install your application on it and run it, because your application now is at the mercy of this legacy environment that has to be created. And you know what now is going to change over time? How you build that environment that the application needs to function within. So one way or another, you're still having to maintain it. You can't get away from it.
And, there's plenty of examples of this type of thing. Part of it coming back to what Jim said, oftentimes this company sells a perpetual license to try to get a bunch of revenue up front. And eventually, after some number of years, decides, well, we really wish we had this person pay per month instead. So we're just going to invalidate the old perpetual licenses or whatever. Sometimes it's even almost fair, like the old MIRC, the Windows IRC client, and people bought licenses for it in the 90s, and we're still getting updates to it today. And the author's like, I feel like people could pay me another $20 again if they need more than 25 years out of this software. And maybe even some of that's fair, but you have to realize whenever you buy anything that's claiming to be perpetual, that it's not really perpetual. It's a for now until some point in the future license.
It expires whenever we say it expires, is what that really means.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. Microsoft pitches pay-to-patch reboot reduction subscription for Windows Server 2025. This sounds awfully familiar to us Linux users, doesn't it?
As well it should, because this is essentially Microsoft's version of the live patch service that Canonical offers for Ubuntu. Now, I don't want to give Canonical too much credit here. While they run that service for Ubuntu, the Linux kernel itself has a live patching mechanism.
Yeah, and other distros can do it as well.
Yeah, precisely. It's just that's not something that's normally freely accessible to end users. You need somebody to manage that. And in Ubuntu land, the way you do that is by purchasing an Ubuntu Pro subscription. Now, one of the things that I found interesting about this is that I would have naively expected Ubuntu Pro to be a lot cheaper than Microsoft's Hotpatch solution, but it doesn't look like that's the case. Now, unsurprisingly, you have to do a lot more math on the Microsoft side. Now, on the Ubuntu side, if you are a community user, you're not using it professionally, you can have Live Patch for free on up to 5 machines with a complimentary Ubuntu Pro subscription. Beyond 5 machines, or if you're using those machines, in business, then you do need to actually purchase the subscription at $500 per year per server machine. Now, on Microsoft's side, you have to do a little bit of math. We all know, unfortunately by now, how much Microsoft loves this per core licensing model, and they've continued with that. They want $1.50 per month per core. But even on a fairly beefy machine, now we're talking at the small business level. Let's say you've got an 8-core server. So that's 8 cores, 16 threads. That'll get you, most Ryzen 7 CPUs or similar. That would cost you 8 cores, $1.50 a month. That's $12 a month. That's going to come out to $144 a year, which is considerably less expensive than the 500 Canonical's offering. Now, the other difference is I didn't see anything on the Microsoft side where anybody can get that for free just because they're not using it in business. Right now, the service is free, but they're about to start requiring the payment. And as far as I can see, they're going to require it from everybody. There may be a way to get in on that, like if you're a Windows Insider member or whatever, but they have not specified any free way to access it for non-commercial use. And I strongly suspect that, as typical for Microsoft products, even if they do have one, it's not going to be as simple and straightforward as it tends to be on the Linux side.
And with the Ubuntu Pro subscription, you could have a monster server with unlimited VMs for your $500.
Yeah, and it's still not quite clear how this will work on an on-premises Hyper-V VM server that's running Windows Server VMs. Will you have to pay for the cores twice? Pay for all the cores once on the host machine and then pay again for how many vCores you've allocated onto each Windows Server VM that you want, because you don't want to have to reboot the VMs much more than you want to have to reboot the host machine beneath them, right? And that's one thing that I did some digging and I haven't been able to find a concrete answer on it. I would like to think that it would work a lot like VM licensing for Windows Data Center Edition. If you have a few VMs, then you install Windows Server Standard on your Windows VMs, and you have to pay for the virtual cores that each one of those VMs uses. If you've got a lot of Windows Server VMs, then you instead buy a copy of Windows Data Server Edition. And as long as all of those VMs are running on the same machine, on the same physical grouping of processors, You only had to buy the one copy, and you can run as many VMs as you can manage to cram on that big beefy box. I'd like to think that this licensing would work the same way, but I don't know.
Yeah, the only thing they say for sure is that the Azure editions of Windows Server that you run in their cloud will continue to get hot patching at no cost.
Well, at no additional cost, because believe me, running VMs in Azure is not cheap, let alone free.
Yeah, that's like the free drinks on an airplane.
And the other thing is that this is basically reboot reduction. It's not actually going to help you that much avoid reboots. So basically every quarter, the first update will be a reboot required update. And then the next 2 patch Tuesdays in that quarter will be hot patched. And so you still have to reboot at a minimum in January, April, July, and October. It's just the other months where most of the time you'll be able to hot patch. But they do say, quote, on rare occasions, for security reasons, we may have to ship a non-hot patch update during a hot patch month, which will require rebooting.
It's also probably worth pointing out that live patching, hot patching, whatever you want to call it, is not without its own risks. It's very handy to say, well, we'll just patch the kernel in memory, and that way we'll get the updated kernel without needing to reboot the system. But when you do that, you then raise the question of whether your system will boot properly. You don't know because you haven't tested that yet. That's one reason that you can't eliminate the reboots entirely, because the longer you go just trying to patch in RAM and hopefully successfully patch on drive without actually testing it, the more likely that you're going to have a really nasty problem. And if anybody else out there has ever encountered a problem where a system runs fine while it's running, but if you lose power, it's an absolute nightmare to get it going again, you have some idea of the kind of risk I'm talking about. That probably covers it for this one, but wrap it up, let's talk about like what it takes to actually use Windows hot patching. Obviously, in Azure, it's already a thing. It's been a thing. You don't need to do anything special. This is about using hot patching on premises, and to do that on premises or in a hybrid environment, you need Windows Server 25 Standard or Data Center, and the server has to be connected to Azure Arc, as well as being subscribed to the hot patch service. It's also worth pointing out that if you're previewing the hot patch service on Windows 2025 on-prem right now, you need to disenroll on or before June the 30th if you want to end the preview. Otherwise, you're automatically going to get subscribed in July. So if you're not hot to start getting billed for these services, cancel them before July.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Johannes writes, I'm running a small file server using a ZFS mirror on FreeBSD 14, which I access via Samba from Windows. Last week, I noticed about 50 photos from 1997 in different directories were empty. The file was there, but ls-l showed 0 bytes. As the modification date of the files was in all cases October the 30th, fixing the problem was easy. I just copied the files from the September snapshot. I guess some application corrupted the files. Is there an easy way to detect and recover other corrupted files? Perhaps not all corrupted files are size 0. My first idea was to consolidate all my previous ZFS snapshots into one directory using rsync and compare this directory as well as all the backup directories with my photo collection. I have other backups, Syncoid and Borg, but the fundamental problem is the same. Going forward, what's the best way to prevent this? Make older directories immutable by file permissions with a shell script in cron? Moving older directories to a read-only dataset? ZFS magic?
Yeah, so there's a couple options there. The easiest one for detecting changes, any changes at all, especially like, if you have a directory here that's for 1997, you don't expect that to change, is there's a built-in command in ZFS, ZFS diff, where you point it at a snapshot, and it will compare that snapshot to the current version of the file system and list any files that have been added, removed, changed, or whatever. And for the 1997 directory, you'd expect that to be no changes. And then so it can highlight any file that's been modified when you didn't expect it to. You can also diff just any 2 snapshots. So if it does show a difference between your September snapshot and now, then you can be like, okay, now check October, November, December, you can iterate through and try to find where exactly the change happened. And that can help you find that. And if you want a way to navigate that a little more easily, especially if you know about the .zfs directory and you can go and browse these snapshots and see the whole file system, but a way to kind of visualize that, there's a tool in most open source package managers called HTTM, or Hot Tub Time Machine. And it provides a time machine-like interface that Apple has, but on top of ZFS snapshots to let you kind of browse the different snapshots and see what's changed between them. And it might be an easy way to kind of visually search for unexpected changes like that.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. As far as the, how do I keep it from happening again? I concur with you that most likely some rogue application did that. Given that the files were all 0 bytes, my best guess is that some application opened those files for write and expected for some reason to rewrite what was in them, but the network connection got reset. That's about the easiest way to end up with a size 0, especially when you already know you're accessing things over Samba, over the network. That can absolutely happen. The application doesn't even necessarily need to be buggy. It just had to have made one unsafe decision that works properly 999 times out of 1,000. Of course, we could get into arguments over whether that constitutes a bug or not. But anyway, I don't think you can guarantee that's not going to happen. And I would definitely be a little paranoid looking for it to not continue happening in general. If it continued happening, I would want to figure out exactly what was causing it and actually fix the root cause. All the other things that we've suggested, using ZFS diff is obviously way more efficient than, trying to use rsync as a tool. Hot Tub Time Machine can make it a lot easier to do that interactively and graphically because you get, an Ncurses style, text ongoing interface rather than having to enter like command after command, make it a lot easier to browse it. But if you start setting up something automated, like a tripwire type function, you can certainly do that. You could pretty easily write a script to use ZFS diff, run once a day to see what all has changed, what's been modified, what's been deleted, whatever. You could even get fancy and have it only get upset about files that, are more than 30 days old that have been modified or deleted when that's a thing that you don't expect. But then the question just becomes, how often do you legitimately change stuff in those directories at some point? And I know it's very easy to say, well, never, this is just for my old stuff. But I find that usually when you really dig into that and really start working through it, people discover really quickly, oh, it turns out I change things a lot more frequently than I thought I did. And although I have all this reporting now and everything that changes every time it changes, it's overwhelming. And it actually does me no good because my eyes just glaze and I don't read any of it.
Yeah. So I think your instincts on what to do about it are probably right. Rather than just permissions, there are a thing a step further on FreeBSD that you mentioned you're using called ch flags instead of chmod. And you can set flags on a file that say, this is immutable by even the root user. And so then even root wouldn't be able to do it, whereas, chmod 000 or whatever, even root can still do things there. So you can flag files as completely immutable, and only by removing that flag can you ever modify the file again. And FreeBSD has a concept called secure levels where you can lock a machine down so that flag can't be taken off without first rebooting to a lower security level. But that's probably overkill for your use case here. But what you mentioned about read-only dataset is probably really interesting there. If you've done a decent job of splitting your data up on ZFS into datasets, then yeah, your photo archive probably should be mounted read-only, and you can manually mount it read-write when you want to archive another month worth of stuff and then set it back to read-only. And then you know that nothing there is ever going to be able to be changed. And that is probably one of the very easiest ways to manage that. Depends, how extensive your photo thing is. Maybe you make a new data set for every month and then automatically set it read-only when you're done with it or whatever.
Frequently, you have a concept like albums in people's photo collections. And, if you have that concept, if that's kind of your metaphor for working with your photos, then yeah, it can make a lot of sense just to have a data set per album. And that way, when you're done with an album, then you can just go ahead and ZFS set, read only equals on that album. And yeah, nothing in there is going to change. And it's very easy that way to toggle it, back off again if you do need to change something and put it right back. That could make more sense for you than setting the entire collection of photos read-only and needing to unlock it every time you want to add a new one or, edit one or something like that, especially if you have other people. Like a lot of the time, once you start digging a little further, you find out, well, yeah, it's mostly me, but, my wife likes to get in there and upload photos as well. And if that's the case, I do not think you're going to have a high spousal approval factor on before you can upload your photos, you have to come talk to me so I can unlock the directory for you, and then I'm going to lock it behind you as soon as you're done. Are you done yet, honey? Because I need to lock this again. I don't think that's going to go over well.
Yeah, I tend to have learned to basically archive my stuff by year instead. And so this year is mostly writable, but everything from previous years is locked down.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.